This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Televised impeachment hearings begin today in the inquiry into whether President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate his political rival Joe Biden and his son. Two witnesses are testifying today before the House Intelligence Committee: George Kent, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and William Taylor, a former ambassador and the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. Both officials have privately told congressional investigators that Trump withheld aid to Ukraine in an attempt to pressure the government to investigate the Bidens. Taylor confirmed there was a quid pro quo. Donald Trump is just the fourth U.S. president to face an impeachment inquiry. Bill Clinton was impeached in 1998. Andrew Johnson was impeached in 1868. Richard Nixon resigned in 1974 prior to an impeachment vote.
Today, we're joined by the legendary journalist Bill Moyers, who covered the Nixon and Clinton impeachment hearings. In the 1960s, Bill Moyers was a founding organizer of the Peace Corps. He served as press secretary for President Lyndon Johnson. In 1971, he began an award-winning career as a television broadcaster on PBS, as well as on CBS and other networks. Moyers has received 37 Emmys, 9 Peabodys, and countless other prizes. He was elected to the Television Hall of Fame in 1995. Last week, Bill Moyers took out a full-page ad in the New York Times urging PBS to broadcast the impeachment hearings live and to rerun them in primetime. Bill Moyers, welcome back to Democracy Now!
Good to see you again, Amy and Juan. Thank you for having me. And I don't know what this legendary means, except does it mean I'm past tense?
You're right here. You're very current and now talking about the future. And thank you so much for that, Bill. Talk about this full-page ad that you took out and what you're calling for.
We're calling for PBS, our friends and colleagues there, to put the hearings on, which they will carry live in the afternoons when they happen, along with CBS, NBC, and other networks, but to put them live as they did with Watergate in prime time, 8 o'clock at night, so people who have worked all day can come home and watch what they missed. Now, my friends at PBS, some of them say to me, well, people can find it. It's on this cable channel. It's on that satellite channel. It's on the internet. But that's different from having to look for it in the wild west of the modern media universe, from being able to see it simply, easily, right there in your living room. And many Americans still get their television the old-fashioned way, from the set in the evening. Prime time is still our public square. And for PBS to repeat the hearings in prime time gives the many millions more people the chance to see it collectively, in a sense, and see what's happening, hear what's happening, and make up their own minds.
And Bill, you were obviously front and center during the Watergate hearings. Talk about the impact of those televised debates on what people thought about Watergate and about President Nixon.
Actually, our two main anchors at that time at PBS, Robert McNeil and Jim Lehrer, were front and center. I did peripheral coverage, and then I did a documentary that summed it all up called Essay on Watergate. What those hearings did was to give millions of Americans the chance to hear the evidence as it unfolded, to test for themselves the credibility of the witnesses, whether they could seem believable or not. PBS was new then. It was a rookie network. Not many people were taking it seriously, and all of a sudden we were the only network in prime time public service that were giving these hearings full exposure with very effective moderation by Jim and Robin, and they didn't get in the way of the testimony. They were not pundits. They were guiding the viewers through it. And as a result, millions of Americans got to see for themselves democracy on trial, how it was handled. It was a more sedate era in Congress then than it is now. It was before Gingrich, who unleashed the forces of wrath when he was Speaker of the House. And people were polite, but they asked serious questions. They developed their stories. And the result was, at the end, Americans felt they had a sense of what it was all about. Nixon, I think, would have been impeached, But before that happened, several Republicans, it was a different Republican Party then, went down to the White House and said, you've got to go. It was those hearings that showed Americans how the process worked. Was the evidence believable? And actually, it was during those hearings that testimony came out about the hidden tapes that Nixon had made of every conversation he had in the White House. From there, they went and found the tape that proved to be the incriminating, indefensible evidence that Nixon had told the FBI to keep the CIA from investigating the charges against him.
And when you talk about punditry, one of the important roles of public broadcasting is precisely not only that, as you say, that the commentators generally take a backseat and let the actual events unfold of themselves rather than constantly commenting, but also there are no commercial interruptions. I mean, the whole idea that you're in a serious public hearing and then whether it's CNN or Fox or ABC, they have to break to commercials and decide what part of the testimony not to cover. It really does have an impact on how people digest the information, doesn't it?
Yes, we slice and dice the news today. All of us do. A bit here, a bit there, an episode here, an episode there. And it's kind of a daily coverage. It's hard to get the main story of the big event that's going on. You know, I have many friends, we all three of us have many friends in commercial television, but commercial networks have made their peace with the little lies and merchandising of our economic system. I mean, that's how they make their living. PBS was intended not to be a commercial enterprise, but to be a public service supported by the public, as we are. In fact, we all pay a little bit in taxes to keep PBS on the air. And that makes a difference. If you can read or see a story without a constant interruption, without somebody else's voice getting inside your ear and beginning to interfere with your story, it's a different experience.
And it's free over the airwaves. That's a big difference.
That's the big thing. It's where everybody can come home and without having paid a cable fee or streaming fee, you can see it right there in your living room.
Let's talk about the difference between the coverage of the Nixon impeachment hearings and what we're seeing today. How do you think the coverage of the impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump on this first day, as we lead into the public part of the inquiry, is happening?
Well, as the New York Times said yesterday, the Watergate hearings took place in a more, as I said earlier, a sedate environment. I mean, the Republicans and Democrats were much more civil to each other than they are in Congress now. That was more a civic education than it was a food fight. The Clinton impeachment became a food fight. That was the turn in our history when the ability of the two parties to seriously explore an issue together dissolved into conflict and accusations and what we see today. But they were able in those days to let the evidence come out slowly. I think it was 51 nights and days that PBS carried the hearings then. Today, as we know, it will be a circus. I mean, there will be efforts to try it, and the Democrats tried it in the Clinton impeachment trials. They tried to keep interrupting the Republicans and prevent them from making their case against Bill Clinton. That, of course, is going to happen in these hearings.
I want to go back to Richard Nixon addressing the country in the face of the growing threat of impeachment.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
After 2 years of denials and under growing pressure, Nixon left the White House on August 9, 1974. He resigned, becoming the only U.S. president ever to resign from office.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
You are here to say goodbye to us, and we don't have a good word for it in English. The best is au revoir. We'll see you again.
Richard Nixon, Bill Moyers, you remember that moment well.
We did see him again, too, because he was resurrected after his political death, and there he was making speeches, writing books, and all that. Yes, I watched that moment and wasn't surprised because I had watched the Watergate hearings all the time, and the evidence was, as I said earlier, indefensible. You couldn't you couldn't undermine that evidence. And there were so many serious constitutional charges against Nixon that the country took it much more seriously than they did the Clinton impeachment.
Well, I mean, there was this seminal moment in the summer of 1973 when Tennessee Republican Senator Fred Harris, people may know him more as the Law and Order DA from television, asked Alexander Butterfield about the existence of any recording system. Butterfield pauses, then details the system for about an hour non-stop. He was only called, he only knew he had 3 hours before, I think, to testify. He didn't have a lawyer with him. He didn't consult with a lawyer. If he did, he might never have revealed this. But talk about that moment.
Well, Alexander Butterfield was an honorable man, and there were many honorable Republicans in that time who decided they had to really be honest with the American people. And when he disclosed that there was this tape, that these tapes existed, and Nixon was on the record so that the members of the Congress and the public could actually hear what he was saying. It was almost like a great sucking in of the breath of the hearings and of Americans. They suddenly knew. They didn't have to take somebody else's word for it. They could listen to Richard Nixon, and you just realize this was going to take a significant turn, a dramatic turn.
Did you ever meet Butterfield?
I did meet Butterfield many years later.
He ran the security system at the White House.
Yes, he was the equivalent of LBJ had his own Alexander Butterfield, but he didn't have as many recordings as Nixon did. Yes, you could almost look at that face again of Alexander Butterfield, making sure he was going to do it and determining to do it and then doing it. I mean, in television, it makes us intimate strangers. That moment made Butterfield an intimate ally of everybody who believed the Constitution was in danger. And it's a memorable moment in American history.
Do you think there's a recording of the Trump phone call?
Well, I have wondered that, not because I know anything, but just watching the pattern of the Nixon hearings and what brought him down finally. I think there could well be a recording of that phone call. I happen to know that, most of Lyndon Johnson's phone calls, important ones, were recorded. Nixon recorded apparently many more than LBJ did. And I'm sure that the security people in the White House have something more telling than we have seen so far, because everything we've seen has had ellipses in it, the transcripts of that phone call, and people have talked around it. But somewhere buried in the White House may well be a recording that, as with the Nixon tapes, we had to go to the court. The Congress had to go to court to get the Supreme Court to rule yes or no on whether those tapes could be made, that tape that Butterfield was talking about could be made public. Congress ruled for the public and for Congress. We could come down to that in this if somebody reveals in the course of the next few days that, yes, there is a tape of the recording between President Trump and the president of Ukraine.
Our guest is the legendary broadcaster, Bill Moyers. Juan?
Bill, I wanted to ask you again about the Watergate hearings. John Dean's testimony as one of the inner circles of the president at the time, the impact that had on the public, and also the fact that in today's situation, President Trump is doing everything possible to prevent any of his inner circle from being able to testify before Congress. In essence, running out the clock on this impeachment process, hoping that there won't be time for the Congress to have the hearings with his people if a court decision has to be made about his inner circle being able to testify.
Exactly. But in those days, they didn't have that defense. And so one witness after another, everybody alive today can remember when John Dean said, "What did you tell the president?" "I told the president there was a cancer on the presidency." And again, you could hear a kind of unanimous gasp in the hearings and around the country. You knew from that we were on to something different from President Johnson in 1866 was impeached. 68 because he had fired the Secretary of War, Stanton. That was the charge against him. This was not a cancer of the presidency. Suddenly you realized there was something metastasizing politically that we had better pay attention to. And John Dean again realized that this was telling the truth now was the only way out of a hole into which the White House had dug itself.
And in some of your statements recently, you've been talking about the importance that of the so many lies that we've been exposed to are actually undermining our democracy. Could you expand on that as well?
You know, all presidents lie. They do so tactically. They do so strategically. Franklin Roosevelt lied about Lend-Lease until he could convince the public to go along with it. All presidents lie. It's a defense they use. But not all presidents lie systemically. Not all presidents lie constantly. And the fact of the matter is, and it's not just the president, not just the White House lies that are filling the atmosphere with this toxic poison that my good friend and colleague Eric Alterman, a very distinguished journalist and professor here of journalism in town, has written about the lies of presidents. There's a wonderful documentary called "All Governments Lie," and they do. But what we have now is a culture of lying, not only from within politics, but from within media that is determined only to protect and save the President of the United States, Donald Trump,
and lying about things big and small.
Yes, exactly. And you don't know what to believe anymore. I still believe that facts matter. But they're trying to change the facts on us. And that's where a few journalists and a few media outlets have a real role to play. It's to always put on the table the evidence against the lies that are being told by the people who have a vested interest in lying.
So what kind of response have you gotten to your full-page ad in the New York Times calling for the airing of these hearings not only live but in prime time, and the significance of PBS? Interestingly, back in Nixon time, Nixon wanted to get rid of PBS.
His special assistant, Pat Buchanan, later the candidate for president and formidable right-wing champion, said, yes, let's just defund it. It's got to get rid of it, not fund it. And here, in those days, PBS bravely stood up and said, we're going to carry the hearing. Now, they were nervous because the right wing was already taking PBS on. Nixon wanted it eliminated. They were harassing, trying to intimidate. But so they asked the stations, what do you think? And only 52% of the stations, just a little over half, said, let's carry the hearings. They did. I think later everyone claimed credit for having carried the hearings. But PBS did its role then as a public educator. You know, impeachment proceedings are a civic education. We rarely get to see democracy on trial. We rarely know what's really happening in government. So much more is happening than we know. And when you have an impeachment hearing, only 4 in Americans' history, counting this one, you get to hear things you would never know otherwise. And PBS carried it all then, as we've said earlier, and people did get the message. Even Republicans changed their position. Both of you are too young to remember that after a while, a handful of Republicans in the Senate, Goldwater among them, Howard Baker among them, went down to see the president and said, Mr. Nixon, Mr. President, you can't stay. You've got to go. That was the power of those hearings. What we're saying to public broadcasting now, and some of my colleagues in public television keep saying, well, the media universe has changed. Well, of course it's changed. I know that. I've been a part of it, of that change. But what hasn't changed is the importance of people to watch what can happen when they can. And we're asking public television stations to put it on prime time, repeat it in prime time. Now, the response has been good from some and begs to differ from the others. I mean, WIDA, our major station in the Washington area, is carrying it live in the afternoon or mornings, live during the day, and repeated in the evenings. Wonderful. The small sister stations up in Vermont, they're carrying it the same way, and they're preempting their regular programming. I mean, it's always painful to disrupt your regular programming, but they're doing it, and they're putting the regular programs on their digital channel, their sub-channel, and they're running a crawl, what we call a crawl in the business, across the bottom of the screen that says you can see Antiques Roadshow, you can see Nova, you can see your regular programming on our sub-channel. But watch this one, because this is what happened today. So, but here in New York, they explain that they think that their sub-channel, their digital sub-channel is enough. They're sticking with their regular programming. I think it's a lost opportunity to help 15 million people in this area see for themselves what they can't see during the day. But public television is not a top-down network. Stations have the autonomy to decide their own programming. Some are and some aren't. If you're living where they aren't, call them.
Well, back in the days of Watergate, there was no alternative like C-SPAN. See, I'm wondering if you expect a sharp rise in the viewership for C-SPAN, because C-SPAN usually not only broadcasts congressional events during the day, but then rebroadcast them in the evenings as well.
That's right. It's available in prime time on C-SPAN if you get C-SPAN. C-SPAN was created by a wonderful, inventive broadcaster in the early 70s. And you can go there now, but it's a small audience. It's like PBS's channels that are marginal. It's a small audience. Sometimes it's difficult to find, although it's there all the time. But PBS is the last remaining. And I'm not claiming for a moment that we'd get the audience we got in 1973 and 1974. Because you do have opportunities through internet, through satellite, through your devices to see it. But there's nothing like seeing it, in a sense, collectively.
Bill, you're a wordsmith. There was a letter written to the New York Times, a plea from 33 writers. Words matter. Stop using quid pro quo. The writers write, a plea from 33 writers. Please use language that will clarify the issues at hand. Please stop using the Latin phrase quid pro quo regarding the impeachment inquiry. Most people don't understand what it means. In any case, it doesn't refer only to a crime. Asking for a favor is not a criminal act. We frequently demand things from foreign countries before giving them aid, like asking them to improve their human rights record. Please use words that refer only to criminal behavior here. Use bribery or extortion to describe Mr. Trump's demand to President Zelensky of Ukraine, making it very clear this is a crime. The more we hear words that carry moral imputations, the more we understand the criminal nature of the act.
Well, language can be used to conceal as well as to reveal. And when it's being employed and subpoenaed to be used to defend a crime, you find a way to call a crime something other than a crime. I don't know. We don't know that what President Trump did regarding Ukraine is a crime in a strict legal sense. But it can well be a crime against the Constitution in its abuse of power. And look, if you listen to the testimony today and in ensuing days, if you read the transcripts, you will see that this is clearly a case. You know, circumstantial evidence is often the basis for a judgment in a legal trial. You will see that this president, in effect, offered to extort the Ukraine out of a difficult situation. And that is a crime against the Constitution if, in fact, it happens. And it's something I would not want a Democratic president to do, to use his power or her power one day to get a foreign government to interfere in our elections.
And then there's the question of whether this impeachment inquiry will expand. With President Clinton, it started as an investigation into Whitewater, and it went on to become around a relationship he had. It'll be very interesting, and we're going to look at that in coming days, the issue of whether this will remain with Ukraine or go to issues like the death of children on the border in U.S. custody, the separation of families, and other issues. But we're going to deal with that in on another day, because today we have to move on to a debate on what's happened in Bolivia. Bill Moyers, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Legendary broadcaster, president of the Schumann Media Center, former host of Moyers and Company on PBS, has won more than 30 Emmys. Democracy Now!, by the way, will be live streaming today's impeachment hearings beginning at 10 Eastern Time at democracynow.org. Come to us. When we come back, we look at the political crisis in Bolivia. President Evo Morales resigned over the weekend following what he described as a coup. A right-wing senator has now declared herself president. Stay with us.